The coffee cup trembled in Margaret Chen's weathered hands as she set it down on the mahogany table, the delicate porcelain clicking against the saucer with a sound that seemed to echo through the hushed atmosphere of the Sterling Club. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the man seated at table 7 lean forward, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the small notepad she'd just placed beside his espresso. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Excuse me." His voice was quiet, controlled, but something in its timbre made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Could you come here for a moment?" The other servers in the exclusive downtown restaurant had warned her about this particular patron. Alexander Whitmore, they whispered, was worth more than the GDP of small countries. His real estate empire stretched across 3 continents. His tech investments had revolutionized entire industries. And his philanthropy, though rarely publicized, had built schools, hospitals, and libraries in forgotten corners of the world. But what they hadn't mentioned was the way he studied people, as if he could read their entire life story in a single glance. Margaret smoothed her black uniform and approached his table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Sterling Club wasn't the kind of place she'd ever imagined working when she'd graduated summa cum laude from Stanford 27 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once sat in boardrooms making decisions that affected thousands of employees, and now she balanced plates and memorized wine pairings for people who'd never know her name. "Sir?" she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander held up the notepad, and Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. There, in her own handwriting, was his order: double espresso, no sugar, extra hot, side of memories, and a dash of regret. She hadn't meant to write that last part. It was something she did sometimes when her mind wandered, adding little philosophical observations to mundane tasks, a habit left over from her days writing strategy reports. "This handwriting," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way you form your G's, the unusual slant of your Y's, the way you dot your I's with tiny circles instead of dots." He looked up at her, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected in his eyes, recognition mixed with an emotion that looked almost like grief. Only one person writes like that. The notepad slipped from Margaret's fingers and fluttered to the Persian rug below. Around them, the soft murmur of conversation continued. Crystal glasses clinked, and somewhere a string quartet played Vivaldi. But all Margaret could hear was the thunderous beating of her own heart. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew it was too late. After 27 years of carefully constructed anonymity, of deliberate invisibility, of serving others instead of leading them, her past had found her in the most impossible way, through the unconscious movement of her pen across paper. Alexander stood slowly, his tall frame unfolding with the measured grace of a man accustomed to boardrooms and power lunches. He was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 55, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and difficult decisions. When he looked at her now, she saw not the casual indifference of a wealthy patron, but the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. "Margaret Elizabeth Rothschild," he said, and the name fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the careful calm she had maintained for so long. Margaret felt her knees buckle slightly, and she gripped the edge of his table for support. The white tablecloth bunched under her fingers, and she noticed absently that her hands were shaking. "That person doesn't exist anymore," she whispered. "She disappeared 27 years ago, the night before she was supposed to announce a merger that would have created the largest media conglomerate in history. A merger that would have put 40,000 people out of work and consolidated power in the hands of 3 families. She vanished without a trace, leaving behind a letter of resignation and a trust fund worth $800 million that she never touched. The string quartet had stopped playing, and Margaret realized with growing horror that other patrons were beginning to stare. Mrs. Harrison, the club's manager, was making her way across the dining room with the determined stride of someone about to handle a situation. Margaret needed to end this conversation before it spiraled further out of control. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake." "There's no mistake." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a weathered manila folder. Inside, Margaret caught a glimpse of newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like private investigator reports. "I've been looking for you for 27 years, Margaret. We all have."
The folder contained pieces of her former life. Images of herself at charity galas, shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at hospital openings. There she was, at 28, radiant in a designer gown, accepting an award for Young Business Leader of the Year. And there, in a grainy surveillance photo that made her stomach lurch, was the last confirmed sighting of Margaret Rothschild, walking out of the family's Manhattan headquarters at 11:47 p.m. on October 13, 1997, carrying nothing but her purse and a single file folder. "Margaret?" Mrs. Harrison appeared at her elbow, her professionally pleasant smile not quite masking her concern. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Alexander said smoothly, his billionaire's charm activating like a switch. "I was just complimenting your server on her excellent penmanship. So rare to find beautiful handwriting these days, don't you think?" Mrs. Harrison smiled relaxed into something more genuine. "Oh yes, Margaret has lovely handwriting. We're so fortunate to have her on our team. She's been with us for 8 years now. One of our most reliable servers." 8 years. Margaret watched Alexander's eyes sharpen as he absorbed this information, adding it to whatever internal calculation he'd been running since the moment he'd seen her notepad. She could practically see the gears turning in his mind. The same analytical precision that had built his empire now focused entirely on unraveling the mystery of her disappearance. "Well," Mrs. Harrison continued, "I'll let you both get back to your afternoon. Margaret, table 12 is asking about the wine selection." As Mrs. Harrison glided away, Alexander leaned closer. "We need to talk. Not here, not like this, but soon." "There's nothing to talk about," Margaret replied, but her voice lacked conviction. She bent to retrieve the fallen notepad, and when she straightened, Alexander was holding out a business card. "My private number. When you're ready to hear why I've spent half my life looking for you, call me." Margaret stared at the card. Heavy stock, embossed lettering, the kind of understated elegance that screamed wealth and power. She'd once had cards like that, back when her name carried weight in boardrooms around the world. "And if I don't call?" Alexander's smile was sad, knowing. "Then I'll keep coming back here every day until you do. That merger you walked away from? It went through anyway 6 months later. 43,000 jobs lost, just like you predicted. 3 families now control 60% of American media. Your father made sure of that." The card felt hot in her palm. "My father's been dead for 15 years. Your father's vision lives on. The Rothschild name still opens doors, still influences policy, still shapes the world in ways you can't imagine. But you already knew that, didn't you? That's why you've stayed hidden all these years." Margaret looked around the dining room, at the crystal chandeliers, the oil paintings of long-dead robber barons, the men in $1,000 suits discussing deals that would affect millions of lives. This world she'd once inhabited, then fled, then found herself serving. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. "Table 12, she said finally. "I'm sorry?" "Table 12 is waiting for me to explain the wine selection. I have a job to do." Alexander nodded slowly. "Of course. But Margaret," he waited until she met his eyes. "The world needs to know what really happened that night. The world needs to know why Margaret Rothschild chose to disappear rather than become one of the most powerful people on the planet." As Margaret walked toward table 12, she felt the weight of Alexander's gaze on her back, and something else. A sensation she hadn't experienced in 27 years. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything, but unable to resist the pull of the abyss below. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of papers as Alexander closed his folder and the quiet chime of his phone as he made a call. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know what he was saying. I found her. After all these years, I finally found Margaret Rothschild. The wine list trembled in her hands as she approached table 12, where 3 business executives waited with the patient impatience of people accustomed to having their needs anticipated. But for the first time in 27 years, Margaret Chen, who had once been Margaret Rothschild, wasn't thinking about wine pairings or table service. She was thinking about a folder of documents in a Manhattan office, about a decision that had torn apart one of America's most powerful families, and the man who just walked back into her carefully constructed world, carrying 27 years' worth of questions.
The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. Every time the club's heavy doors opened, Margaret's pulse spiked. She found herself making small mistakes, bringing the wrong wine to table 4, forgetting to mention the lunch specials to a group of regular customers, dropping a fork that clattered across the marble floor like a gunshot. "You okay today?" Rebecca asked, during a brief lull between the breakfast and lunch rushes. They were standing in the service station, rolling silverware into cloth napkins, a mindless task that usually helped Margaret center herself. "Fine," Margaret replied automatically, then caught herself. Rebecca had been nothing but kind to her over the years, covering her shifts when she was sick, sharing stories about her own struggles as a single mother putting herself through nursing school. She deserved better than dismissive lies. "Actually, no, I'm not okay. Someone from my past showed up yesterday and I'm not sure how to handle it." Rebecca's hand stilled on the napkin she was folding. "Bad past or just complicated past?" "Complicated," Margaret said after a moment's consideration. "Very complicated. You want some advice from someone who's made her share of mistakes?" Margaret looked at her friend, really looked at her. She was 35, pretty in an understated way, with laugh lines around her eyes and calluses on her hands from years of working multiple jobs to support her daughter. She never had the luxury of choice that Margaret had grown up with, never had trust funds or family connections to fall back on, yet she radiated a contentment, a sense of purpose that Margaret envied. "I'm listening." "The past is only as powerful as we let it be. I spent 3 years running from my ex-husband, changing jobs, changing apartments, changing my whole life because I was terrified he'd find us. You know what I learned? Running takes more energy than facing whatever you're afraid of. And at some point, you realize that the person you became while running might be worth fighting for." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "What if the person you were before hurt people? What if facing the past means admitting you were a coward? Then you figure out how to make it right, but you can't do that from hiding." 1 o'clock arrived with ruthless punctuality. Margaret watched from across the dining room as Alexander Whitmore was seated at table 7, noting the way other patrons glanced at him with a mixture of recognition and deference. He commanded attention without trying, carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Margaret had once moved through life with that same confidence. She approached his table with steady steps, notepad in hand, her server's smile carefully in place. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. Can I start you with something to drink?" Alexander looked up from the menu he hadn't been reading, and Margaret saw that his steel-gray eyes held no triumph, no satisfaction at having cornered her. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like sadness. "Just coffee, please. Black." He paused, then added quietly, "And perhaps we could dispense with the performance. We both know why I'm here." Margaret glanced around the dining room. Several tables were within earshot, and Mrs. Harrison was making her rounds, checking on VIP guests. "I'm working, Mr. Whitmore, whatever you think you know about me. I know that you've been sending money to the Jennifer Morrison Scholarship Fund for the past 8 years, $300 a month like clockwork. Jennifer Morrison was the name of your roommate at Stanford, the one who died in the car accident junior year. The same car accident that made you decide to study business instead of social work, the same tragedy that convinced you that money was the only real power in the world. Margaret felt the notepad slip from nerveless fingers. How could you possibly know that? Because I know everything about Margaret Rothschild. I've made it my business to know. The question is, do you know anything about Alexander Whitmore? Margaret stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The expensive suit, the perfectly groomed appearance, the easy confidence, it all screamed old money, establishment power. But there was something else, something in the way he held himself that spoke of hard-won success rather than inherited privilege. "You're self-made," she said suddenly. "Not born wealthy. You built your fortune, didn't inherit it." Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. "Very good. What else?" Despite herself, Margaret found her analytical mind engaging, the same instincts that once had made her a formidable strategist kicking into gear. She studied his face, his hands, the way he carried himself. "You're not married. No tan line from a wedding ring, and you have the slightly hollow look of someone who works too much and has no one waiting at home. You're lonely. Anything else?" Margaret took a breath, following an instinct she couldn't quite name. "You knew Jennifer Morrison." The words fell between them like a match into gasoline. Alexander's carefully composed expression cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. For a moment, he looked like a man who'd been carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear. "I was driving the car," he said. The confession hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sank into the chair opposite him, protocol forgotten, her mind reeling with the implications. "That's impossible. The other driver was killed. The police report said—" The police report was wrong, or rather, it was deliberately misleading. Alexander's voice was barely a whisper now. "My father made sure of that. One phone call, one favor called in, one family's tragedy transformed into an acceptable accident with no one to blame." Margaret felt the world tilting around her. Jennifer's death had been the defining moment of her life, the tragedy that had convinced her to abandon her dreams of social work and embrace the family business instead. She'd believed that money and power were the only things that mattered, because money and power could have prevented Jennifer's death, could have bought better medical care, safer roads, a different outcome. "She was coming to see me," Alexander continued. We were in love. Secret, of course. My father would never have approved of me dating a scholarship student. I was 21, stupid, and convinced that I could keep our relationship hidden while still having everything I wanted. I picked her up that night to take her to dinner, somewhere outside the city where no one would recognize us. Margaret's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she'd believed for 27 years. "But you were never mentioned in any of the reports. There was no passenger." "Because I wasn't in the car when it crashed." Alexander's voice broke slightly. "We'd had a fight about hiding, about secrecy, about my cowardice in the face of my family's expectations. She got out of the car at a gas station, said she'd rather walk home than spend another minute with someone too ashamed to be seen with her. I let her go. I was angry, hurt, too proud to follow her. She started walking back to campus alone." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Jennifer's body had been found on the side of Highway 101, the victim of a hit-and-run driver who'd never been caught. Margaret had always wondered why Jennifer had been walking alone on such a dangerous stretch of road. "The car that hit her," Margaret whispered, "was driven by Thomas Caldwell," Alexander said, his hands shaking now. "Son of one of my father's business partners. He was drunk, coming home from a party. When he realized what he'd done, he called his father, who called my father. Within 2 hours, there was a different car in the Caldwell garage. Thomas was on a plane to Europe, and the whole incident was quietly buried beneath layers of money and influence. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a realignment of everything she'd believed about power and justice and the nature of the world. "And you've carried this secret for 30 years?" "I've carried the guilt for 30 years. The secret I've been carrying for 27 years, ever since the night you disappeared rather than become part of the same system that killed Jennifer and covered it up." Margaret looked around the dining room, at the wealthy patrons enjoying their lunches, at the servers weaving between tables, at the oil paintings of industrial titans who'd built their fortunes on the backs of others. She'd spent 8 years serving this world while hiding from her place in it, but she'd never truly escaped. The Sterling Club was just another manifestation of the same power structures she'd fled. "You're looking for me because you think I had the right idea, walking away from it all? I've been looking for you because I think you're the only person who might know how to tear it all down." The revelation hung between them like smoke from a hidden fire, acrid and inescapable. Margaret stared at Alexander across the pristine white tablecloth, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd just revealed. Around them, the refined chatter of the Sterling Club continued. Crystal glasses clinked against porcelain, and the string quartet played Mozart with mechanical precision. But Margaret felt as though she'd been transported to an entirely different universe, one where the foundations of her carefully reconstructed life had just crumbled beneath her feet. "You can't be serious," she finally managed. "Tear down what exactly? The entire economic system? 3 centuries of accumulated wealth and power? The invisible networks that actually run this country?" Alexander leaned forward, his gray eyes intense with a fervor she recognized. It was the same look she'd seen in her mirror during those final weeks at Rothschild Industries, when she'd begun to understand the true scope of what her family's empire represented. "I'm talking about the consortium." The word hit her like ice water. Margaret hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 27 years, but it still carried the weight of whispered conversations in private clubs, handshake agreements worth billions, and decisions that shaped global markets. The consortium wasn't an official organization. It had no bylaws, no membership roster, no public presence. It was simply what happened when the 20 most powerful families in America decided that cooperation was more profitable than competition. "The consortium died with my father," Margaret said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. "Your father's death was a setback, not an ending. 5 families stepped into the void: the Whitworths, the Sterlings, the Hartfords, the Caldwells, and the Moreaus. They've spent the last 15 years consolidating power, buying politicians, and reshaping policy to serve their interests. What you walked away from in 1997 was just the beginning." Margaret felt her server's mask slipping, the careful composure she'd maintained for 8 years fragmenting under the weight of suppressed memories. She could see Mrs. Harrison across the dining room, watching their table with growing concern. A private conversation that went on too long, especially one that looked as intense as theirs clearly did, was exactly the kind of disruption that could cost Margaret her job. "I need to get back to work," she said, starting to rise. "Margaret, wait." Alexander's hand shot out, not quite touching hers, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his palm. "There's something else you need to know, about why I've spent 27 years looking for you specifically." Despite every instinct screaming at her to walk away, Margaret sank back into her chair. "What?" "The night you disappeared, you took something with you, a file folder, according to the security footage. What was in that folder?" Margaret's mind raced back to that October evening in 1997. She had been in her father's study, going through the final details of the media merger that would have made her one of the most powerful people in America. The contracts were perfect, the regulatory approvals were in place, and the press release was scheduled for the following morning. It should have been her moment of triumph. Instead, it had been the moment she'd discovered the truth about what her family really was. "The Morrison file," she said quietly. Alexander's face went pale. "Jesus, you found it." "Found it? I created it. 3 months of investigation, following money trails and payoff schemes and buried reports. I thought I was being thorough, doing due diligence on our acquisition targets. Instead, I uncovered a network of corruption that went back decades." The Morrison file had been Margaret's attempt to document every crime, every cover-up, every life destroyed by the casual application of wealth and influence. Jennifer Morrison's death was just one entry in a ledger of horrors: industrial accidents covered up, environmental disasters blamed on equipment failure, whistleblowers discredited and destroyed. The file contained names, dates, financial records, and enough evidence to bring down a dozen powerful families. I spent weeks trying to convince myself that I could reform the system from within, that I could take control of the family business and use our power for good. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. Alexander nodded slowly. "And so you walked away?" "I burned it all down and walked away," Margaret corrected. "The Morrison file, my trust fund, my identity, everything. I thought if I could just disappear completely, if I could become someone small and powerless and invisible, I could finally be free of it all." "But you weren't free, were you? You've been carrying that knowledge for 27 years, watching the world get worse while you served coffee to the people making it happen." Margaret looked around the dining room with new eyes, seeing not elegant patrons, but the beneficiaries of a system built on exploitation. Table 3 hosted a defense contractor whose company had just secured a no-bid contract worth $2 billion. Table 8's occupant owned factories in Bangladesh where workers earned 30 cents an hour. The woman at Table 12 had inherited a pharmaceutical fortune built on price-fixing scandals that killed diabetics who couldn't afford insulin. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Alexander glanced around, then pulled out his phone and showed her a banking app. "I've liquidated everything. $53 billion, sitting in escrow accounts, waiting to be deployed. I've spent the last 5 years quietly divesting from every industry that profits from human misery: defense, private prisons, predatory lending, pharmaceutical price gouging. The money is clean now, and I want to use it to burn down everything my father's generation built." $53 billion, Margaret repeated, stunned. "You're talking about economic warfare." "I'm talking about justice. Targeted investments to support ethical alternatives, strategic buyouts to shut down the worst corporate predators, funding for investigative journalists and whistleblowers and activist organizations. Most importantly, I want to resurrect the Morrison file and release it to the world." Margaret felt her heart racing. The scope of what Alexander was proposing was breathtaking and terrifying. "You realize they'll destroy you for this. The families, the politicians, the entire power structure will come after you with everything they have." "They can try. But here's the thing about having $53 billion. It buys you a lot of protection. More importantly, it buys you the ability to fight back." "And you want me to help because you're the only person who's ever walked away from that world by choice. You understand it from the inside, but you're not corrupted by it anymore. You've spent 8 years learning what it means to be powerless, to work for wages, to depend on the kindness of others. You've lived on both sides of the equation." Margaret felt the weight of every decision she'd made over the past 27 years pressing down on her shoulders. The quiet life she'd built, the anonymity she'd treasured, the safety she'd found in serving others instead of commanding them, all of it was about to be stripped away. "Mrs. Harrison is coming over," she said. Noticing the club manager's determined approach, "I need to—" "Margaret?" Mrs. Harrison appeared beside their table with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you've been away from your section for quite some time. Table 4 is asking for their check, and Table 9 needs wine recommendations." Margaret started to stand, but Alexander spoke first. "Actually, Mrs. Harrison, I was just offering Margaret the position with my foundation. We're launching a new initiative focused on hospitality industry reform, and her expertise would be invaluable." Mrs. Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Oh, well, that's wonderful. Margaret, you didn't mention you had experience in philanthropy." "I have some background in strategic planning," Margaret said carefully, her mind reeling at how quickly Alexander had improvised a plausible cover story. "But, Mr. Whitmore, I'm not sure I'm qualified." "Nonsense. Your insights today have been exactly what we need. The position comes with a substantial salary increase, full benefits, and the opportunity to make a real difference in workers' lives." Alexander's smile was perfectly calibrated to convey generous employer rather than conspirator. "Of course, you'd need to start immediately. This afternoon, in fact." Margaret stared at him, recognizing the chess move for what it was. He'd just engineered her exit from the Sterling Club in a way that seemed like career advancement rather than flight. Mrs. Harrison was practically beaming with vicarious pride, delighted that one of her servers had been discovered by a billionaire patron. I would need time to think about it," Margaret said weakly. "Of course. Why don't you take the rest of the day to consider the offer? We could meet this evening to discuss details." Mrs. Harrison clapped her hands together. "Margaret, this is such an exciting opportunity. Of course you should go. Rebecca can cover your tables for the rest of the shift." Margaret felt the walls of her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. In the space of 24 hours, she'd gone from invisible server to recognized heiress to potential co-conspirator in a $53 billion campaign against the most powerful families in America. The speed of the transformation was dizzying. "All right," she heard herself saying, "I'll consider your offer." Alexander stood and extended his hand. "Excellent. Shall we say 7 o'clock? I'll send a car." As Margaret shook his hand, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small scar on his palm, white against his tan skin. It was the kind of mark left by broken glass, and she wondered if it dated from that night 30 years ago when Jennifer Morrison had gotten out of his car and walked to her death. 7 o'clock, she agreed. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, mechanically cleaning her locker and saying goodbye to coworkers who congratulated her on her good fortune. James cornered her in the employee break room, his weathered face creased with concern. "This is happening awfully fast. You sure you know what you're getting into?" Margaret thought about the Morrison file, about $53 billion in escrow accounts, and the network of corruption that had shaped American policy for decades. "No," she said honestly. "I have no idea what I'm getting into." "But you're going anyway." "I think I have to. I've been running from something for 27 years, and it finally caught up with me. Maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back." James nodded slowly. "Just remember, the restaurant business will always be here if you need it. Kitchens don't care about your past, only whether you can do the work." Margaret hugged him, surprising them both. "Thank you. For everything." As Margaret walked home for the city streets she'd traversed thousands of times before, everything looked different. The homeless veteran outside the subway station wasn't just a sad reminder of societal failure, he was a victim of a system that prioritized defense contractor profits over veteran care. The payday loan shop on the corner wasn't just predatory business, it was part of a deliberate network designed to trap the working poor in cycles of debt. The luxury condos rising where affordable housing once stood weren't just gentrification. They were the physical manifestation of policies bought and paid for by real estate dynasties. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to her studio apartment, each step feeling like she was ascending toward a precipice. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Car will be there at 6:45. We have a lot to discuss. AW." She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the delete button. She could still back out, could call Mrs. Harrison and claim she'd reconsidered, could slip back into the anonymous safety of her server's life. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Margaret knew it was too late. Alexander had been right about one thing. She'd been carrying the weight of the Morrison file for 27 years, and the burden had only grown heavier with time. Her apartment suddenly felt impossibly small. The single room that had once represented freedom from her family's expectations now seemed like a prison cell. Margaret opened her laptop, a 3-year-old model she'd saved months to afford, and for the first time in years, she accessed news websites beyond local weather and restaurant industry publications. The headlines were a catalog of horrors that the Morrison file had predicted. Pharmaceutical companies charging diabetics $1,000 for insulin that cost $5 to manufacture, private equity firms buying nursing homes and cutting staff until elderly residents died of neglect, defense contractors lobbying for unnecessary wars to boost their stock prices, environmental regulations gutted to increase fossil fuel profits. Every story was connected to the same handful of families, the same network of influence that Margaret had tried to escape by disappearing. The consortium might have evolved since her father's death, but its essential purpose remained unchanged: to concentrate wealth and power among a small group of people who viewed the rest of humanity as expendable resources. Margaret's hands began to shake as she read deeper, following money trails and political connections that led back to names she recognized from childhood dinner parties. The Sterlings owned the pharmaceutical company that had jacked up insulin prices. The Hartfords controlled the private equity firm destroying nursing homes. The Caldwells, the same family whose son had killed Jennifer Morrison, now ran the largest defense contracting operation in the world. A knock at her door interrupted her growing horror. Margaret glanced at the clock, 6:40 p.m. She opened the door to find a professionally dressed woman in her 30s with a kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Chen, I'm Sarah Martinez, Mr. Whitmore's assistant. I'm here to escort you to your meeting." Margaret grabbed her purse and followed Sarah downstairs to where a modest black sedan waited at the curb. Not the ostentatious limousine she'd expected, but something that could blend into traffic without drawing attention. As they drove through the city, Sarah made polite conversation about the weather and traffic, giving no indication that she knew anything about the true nature of Margaret's meeting with her employer. They pulled up outside a nondescript office building in the financial district, its glass facade revealing nothing about the activities within. Sarah led Margaret through a lobby that could have belonged to any mid-sized consulting firm, past security guards who nodded respectfully but didn't ask for identification. An elevator rose smoothly to the 40th floor, where the doors opened to reveal a space that defied the building's mundane exterior. The penthouse office was a study in controlled elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while the interior was furnished with pieces that managed to be both expensive and understated. But what caught Margaret's attention were the walls, which were covered with what looked like war room displays. Organizational charts, financial flow diagrams, and photographs connected with red string like something from a conspiracy thriller. Alexander stood at the center of it all, no longer the polished patron from the Sterling Club, but something more dangerous. A man with the resources of a nation-state and the focused intensity of someone planning a revolution. "Welcome to the real Alexander Whitmore," he said, gesturing to the displays around them. "What you see here is 15 years of investigation, documentation, and strategic planning. Every connection, every hidden ownership structure, every off-the-books transaction that keeps the consortium functioning." Margaret walked slowly around the room, studying the displays with the analytical mind she'd suppressed for so long. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. Alexander hadn't just been searching for her, he'd been building a comprehensive intelligence operation targeting the most powerful families in America.
"This is insane," she said finally. "The amount of resources this must have required, the legal risks you've taken." "The legal risks pale in comparison to the moral ones of doing nothing," Alexander interrupted. "Look at this." He led her to a section of wall covered with newspaper clippings and medical reports. "The Sterling Pharmaceutical Division has increased insulin prices by 4,000% in the last decade. Diabetics are dying because they can't afford medication that costs pennies to produce. Sarah's daughter is one of them." Margaret looked at Sarah, who had followed them upstairs and was now standing quietly beside the elevator doors. The woman's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing a grief so profound it made Margaret's chest ache. "Sarah was 14, Sarah said quietly, "diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 10. We had insurance, but it didn't cover the full cost of her insulin. I was working 3 jobs, trying to save enough to buy her next month's supply. She died on a Tuesday morning because I was $12 short of what the pharmacy demanded." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "Help us make sure it doesn't happen to other children." Alexander moved to another section of the display. "The Hartford's private equity firm has bought 600 nursing homes in the last 5 years. They've cut nursing staff by 40% and reduced food budgets to $3 per resident per day. Infection rates have tripled, and elderly residents are dying of preventable diseases." He pointed to a photograph of a frail woman in a hospital bed. "Maria Santos, that's her grandmother. The same Maria who's been training as a server at your club. Maria doesn't know that the company responsible for her grandmother's death is owned by people she serves lunch to every day." Margaret remembered Maria's bright smile, her eagerness to learn, her determination to save money for college. The young woman had mentioned her grandmother's health problems, but never the horrific conditions that had likely contributed to her suffering. "And the Caldwells?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Alexander's expression darkened. "They've built the largest defense contracting empire in history. They've lobbied for 11 unnecessary military interventions in the last decade, resulting in the deaths of over 200,000 civilians and 47,000 American service members, all to boost their quarterly profits." The room seemed to spin around Margaret as the full scope of the consortium's crimes came into focus. These weren't abstract policy failures or unfortunate market outcomes. They were deliberate acts of violence committed by people who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. The Morrison file documented the beginnings of all this. If I'd released it 27 years ago, you would have been destroyed, and the evidence would have been buried. You weren't ready then, and the world wasn't ready to hear it. But things have changed. Social media has democratized information distribution. Investigative journalists are crowdfunding their work instead of depending on corporate media outlets. Whistleblowers have secured channels to leak documents without being traced. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere below, people were going to bed hungry because food corporations had inflated prices to maximize shareholder returns. Somewhere, parents were choosing between rent and medicine because pharmaceutical companies had turned human suffering into profit margins. Somewhere, families were mourning loved ones killed in wars designed to enrich defense contractors. "What exactly are you proposing we do?" she asked. Alexander joined her at the window. "We expose everything. The Morrison file was just the beginning. I've documented 27 years of additional crimes, accumulated enough evidence to destroy every family in the consortium. We release it all simultaneously, through every possible channel, with enough supporting documentation that it can't be dismissed or discredited. They'll fight back. They have politicians, judges, entire media networks in their pockets. Which is why we need to move quickly and comprehensively. I've been building a network of allies, investigative journalists, ethical prosecutors, reform politicians, and activist organizations. When we release the evidence, we'll have legal teams ready to file criminal charges, regulatory agencies prepared to revoke licenses, and media outlets committed to covering the story regardless of advertising pressure.
Margaret turned to face him. And what happens to us? You think the consortium is just going to accept the destruction of their empire? They've killed for less. They might try, but I've taken precautions. Alexander gestured to Sarah, who was typing rapidly on her phone. I've established dead man switches. If anything happens to either of us, the evidence gets released automatically. I've also hired the best security firm in the world and relocated my most vulnerable allies to safe locations. You've thought of everything. I've tried to. The question is whether you're willing to help me see it through. Margaret looked around the room one more time, taking in the overwhelming evidence of institutionalized cruelty and corruption. For 27 years, she'd told herself that walking away had been the moral choice, that refusing to participate in the system was a form of resistance. But she'd been lying to herself. Her silence had been complicity. Her anonymity had been cowardice. The Morrison file is hidden in a safety deposit box. Bank of America, downtown branch. I can get it tomorrow morning. Alexander's smile was fierce with hope. Then we're really doing this. Margaret thought about Jennifer Morrison, about Sarah's daughter Emma, about Maria's grandmother, and all the other victims whose names she didn't know, but whose suffering was just as real. She thought about the 27 years she'd spent serving the very people responsible for that suffering, smiling politely while they discussed their next acquisition over expensive wine. We're doing this, she confirmed, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we don't just tear down the old system, we build something better to replace it. I want detailed plans for how we restructure the economy to serve human needs instead of concentrated wealth. Already in progress. I've been working with economists and policy experts for 3 years. Second, we protect the people who work for these companies. When we destroy their employers, we make sure they have job retraining, unemployment benefits, and alternative employment opportunities. The secretaries and janitors and security guards aren't our enemies. They're victims, too. Agreed. Third, we start with the worst offenders, the Sterlings and their pharmaceutical price fixing. Let's begin by making insulin free for every diabetic in America. Alexander's eyes lit up with something that looked like vindication. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already identified the regulatory vulnerabilities in their patent protections and the shell companies they use to hide their profits. With the right pressure, we can force them to either lower prices voluntarily or face criminal prosecution for price-fixing conspiracies. Margaret felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same rush she'd experienced in her corporate days when a complex strategy suddenly clicked into place. But this time, the stakes weren't market share or quarterly profits. They were human lives. How long do we have before they realize what we're doing? She asked. Not long. My sudden interest in you at the Sterling Club was noticed. There are people whose job it is to monitor potential threats to the consortium's interests. I'd estimate we have perhaps a week before they start taking countermeasures. Then we'd better work fast. Sarah looked up from her phone. I've confirmed that our allied journalists are ready to receive evidence packages. The legal teams are standing by. The regulatory contacts are prepared to act on documented violations. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her old identity settling back onto her shoulders like armor. Margaret Rothschild, the architect of the most comprehensive corporate warfare campaign in American history, was awakening after 27 years of dormancy. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of clandestine meetings, encrypted communications, and the careful choreography of a revolution disguised as legitimate business activities. Margaret found herself living in 2 worlds simultaneously. By day, she was Margaret Chen, former server who'd accepted a consulting position with the Whitmore Foundation. By night, she was Margaret Rothschild, the architect of the most comprehensive corporate warfare campaign in American history. Alexander's penthouse office had been transformed into a command center that hummed with constant activity.
Secure laptops lined every available surface. Wall-mounted monitors displayed real-time financial data from markets around the world. And teams of investigators, lawyers, and journalists worked in shifts around the clock. The atmosphere was charged with the electric intensity of people who knew they were making history.
Phase 1 launches in 6 hours, announced Dr. Elizabeth Warren. Not the senator, but a forensic accountant who'd spent the last decade untangling corporate fraud cases for the Department of Justice before Alexander had recruited her with an offer she couldn't refuse. Sterling Pharmaceuticals stock is going to crater the moment the first story breaks. Margaret studied the timeline projected on the main screen. The coordinated attack would begin at 6 a.m. Eastern with simultaneous publication of exposé articles in The Washington Post, New York Times, Guardian, and ProPublica. By 8 a.m., the Securities and Exchange Commission would announce a formal investigation into Sterling's pricing practices. By noon, attorneys general from 12 states would file criminal charges. By market close, Alexander's short positions would have generated enough profit to fund the next phase of their campaign. "What about the countermeasures?" Margaret asked. "They're not going to just accept this passively." Sarah Martinez looked up from her communications console. "We're already seeing movement. 3 private investigators were spotted outside your old apartment building this morning. Alexander's personal security detail has been upgraded to threat level orange. And there's been unusual activity in the financial networks, large cash transfers to accounts associated with crisis management firms." Margaret nodded grimly. The consortium's response was predictable, but still dangerous. They would attempt to discredit the evidence, intimidate the witnesses, and use their political connections to derail investigations. The next few days would be a race between justice and institutional corruption, with billions of dollars and countless lives hanging in the balance. "Margaret?" Alexander appeared at her elbow with a secure phone. "There's someone who wants to talk to you." Margaret took the phone, noting the encrypted connection indicator. "Hello? Is this really Margaret Rothschild? The Margaret Rothschild who disappeared 27 years ago?" "Who is this?" "My name is Viktor Petrov. I was your father's business partner in several delicate ventures. I've been following Mr. Whitmore's activities with great interest." Margaret felt ice form in her veins. Viktor Petrov was a ghost from her family's darkest secrets, a financier whose connections stretched from Wall Street to the Kremlin to offshore havens where money went to disappear forever. If Petrov was calling, it meant the consortium had escalated their response to a level she hadn't anticipated. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you a deal. Call off your attack on the Sterling family, and I will provide you with information about your father's death that might surprise you." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Her father had died of a heart attack 15 years ago, a tragic but unremarkable end to a life of stress and excess. "My father died of natural causes." "Did he? Or did he die because he discovered that his most trusted partners had been embezzling from the family trust for decades?" "Your father was planning to expose us, Margaret. We couldn't allow that to happen." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the desk for support, her mind reeling with the implications. If her father had been murdered, if the consortium had been stealing from the Rothschild fortune for years, then everything she'd believed about her family's legacy was a lie. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Check the family trust accounts, Margaret, the ones in Switzerland that you never touched. You'll find that your inheritance, all $800 million of it, was transferred to consortium-controlled entities 6 months after your father's death. The money you've been too noble to claim, it's been funding the very system you're trying to destroy." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. Alexander was at her side immediately. His face creased with concern as he watched her reaction to whatever Petrov was telling her. "What's your offer?" she managed. "Stop the Sterling attack, and I will transfer your inheritance back to accounts under your control. $800 million, plus 15 years of compound interest, enough to fund any charitable causes you might wish to support, without the messiness of destroying established institutions." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of the choice being offered to her. $800 million could fund schools, hospitals, scholarship programs. It could help thousands of people without the risks and chaos of their current campaign. But it would also mean allowing the Sterling family to continue profiting from diabetic deaths, would mean abandoning Sarah's quest for justice for her daughter Emma, would mean perpetuating the very system she'd spent 27 years trying to escape. "I need time to think," she said.
You have 2 hours. If the Sterling story publishes as scheduled, the offer is withdrawn permanently. And Margaret, you should know that we've identified several of your current associates. It would be unfortunate if anything were to happen to them. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Around her, the command center continued its purposeful activity, but she felt suddenly isolated, as though she were standing at the center of a storm while chaos whirled around her. "What did he say?" Alexander asked quietly. Margaret looked at him, this man who'd spent 15 years searching for her, who'd liquidated his entire fortune to fund their campaign, who'd trusted her with secrets that could destroy his life. How could she tell him that her father had been murdered by the same people they were trying to expose? How could she admit that the money she'd self-righteously refused to touch had been stolen and used to fund atrocities around the world? "He offered me a bribe," she said finally. $800 million to call off the attack. Alexander's eyes hardened. The inheritance you never claimed. The inheritance that was apparently stolen from the family trust years ago. Viktor Petrov just admitted that the consortium has been using my money to fund their operations. The implications hit Alexander immediately. That's why they've been so successful. They've had access to Rothschild's resources all along, using your father's fortune to consolidate their power. Margaret felt a new surge of rage, hotter and more focused than anything she had experienced in 27 years. The consortium hadn't just murdered her father. They'd stolen his legacy and perverted it into an instrument of oppression. Every insulin death, every nursing home scandal, every unnecessary war had been partially funded by money that should have been building schools and hospitals. "There's more," she said. "He claims they murdered my father when he discovered the embezzlement." Alexander went very still. "Do you believe him?" Margaret thought back to her father's final weeks, remembering details she'd suppressed for years. He'd been agitated, suspicious, spending long hours on encrypted phone calls and reviewing financial documents she wasn't allowed to see. She had assumed it was routine business stress, but what if he'd been investigating his own partners? "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Dr. Warren looked up from her computer station. "We have a problem. Sterling Pharmaceutical stock just jumped 12% in after-hours trading. Someone's buying massive quantities, artificially inflating the price." Alexander cursed under his breath. "They're trying to minimize the damage from our short positions. If the stock doesn't crash when the story breaks, we won't generate enough profit to fund Phase 2. Margaret studied the financial displays, her strategic mind automatically calculating probabilities and consequences. The consortium was moving faster than they'd anticipated, deploying resources and tactics that suggested a level of preparation she hadn't expected. Viktor Petrov's call hadn't just been a bribe attempt. It had been a distraction, buying time for their financial countermeasures. "How much cash do we have in reserve?" she asked. "About $2 billion in liquid assets. But if we can't profit from the Sterling crash, we won't have enough to sustain a prolonged campaign." Margaret walked to the windows, looking out at the city lights that represented millions of lives affected by consortium policies. Somewhere below, diabetics were rationing insulin and hoping to survive until payday. Somewhere, elderly residents of Sterling-owned nursing homes were lying in soiled beds because there weren't enough staff to provide basic care. Somewhere, military families were grieving loved ones killed in wars designed to boost defense contractor profits. "I have a counter-proposal for Mr. Petrov," she said finally. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What kind of counter-proposal?" Margaret turned back to the room, her face set with determination. "We're going to take my inheritance back tonight.
and we're going to use every penny of it to destroy the people who stole it. Sarah looked up from her communication station. How exactly do we steal $800 million from Swiss bank accounts controlled by international criminals? Margaret smiled, and for the first time in 27 years, it was the smile of Margaret Rothschild. Brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely confident in her ability to outmaneuver any opponent. We don't steal it. We reclaim it. And I know exactly how to do it. Over the next 4 hours, Margaret orchestrated the most complex financial operation of her life. Using her intimate knowledge of the Rothschild family's banking relationships and security protocols, she guided Alexander's team through a series of legal maneuvers that systematically challenged every transfer of money from the family trust.
The key was Margaret's biological identity. DNA evidence proved she was the rightful heir to the Rothschild fortune. And Swiss banking laws were surprisingly strict about unauthorized transfers from hereditary accounts. With the help of a legal team that had been standing by for exactly this scenario, Margaret filed formal challenges to every transaction that had occurred after her father's death. The process was expedited by evidence that Alexander's investigators had already gathered: financial records showing suspicious patterns of transfers, communications between consortium members discussing the embezzlement, and forensic accounting that traced the stolen money through layers of shell companies. By 4 a.m., the Swiss banking authorities had frozen all accounts connected to the contested transfers. By 5 a.m., Margaret had provided sufficient documentation to prove her identity and claim on the family trust. By 5:30 a.m., she had full access to accounts containing just over $1 billion. Her original inheritance plus 15 years of compound interest, minus the amounts that had already been spent on consortium activities. "It's done," announced the lead attorney via secure video link from Geneva. "Miss Rothschild has full control of the family trust assets. The accounts are now under American jurisdiction and protected by federal banking regulations." Margaret stared at the account balances displayed on her laptop screen. $1,047,632,000. More money than most countries' annual budgets, now under her direct control and dedicated to a single purpose: justice for the victims of consortium crimes. "Phase 1 proceeds as scheduled," she announced to the room. "But now we have enough funding to launch all 6 phases simultaneously." Alexander looked at her with something approaching awe. "You just pulled off the largest financial recovery in history. I just took back what was always mine, and now we're going to use it to make sure no one else has to die for their profits." At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, the first stories broke simultaneously across 4 major news outlets. The headlines were devastating. Internal documents reveal pharmaceutical giant's price-fixing conspiracy. Sterling family fortune built on diabetic deaths. The insulin files, how one company turned medicine into extortion. Margaret watched the real-time reactions flooding social media. Parents sharing stories of diabetic children. Elderly people describing rationing medicine. Healthcare workers documenting preventable deaths. The human cost of Sterling's greed was suddenly visible to the entire world, and the response was immediate and visceral. Sterling Pharmaceutical stock went into free fall, dropping 46% in the first hour of trading, despite the artificial support the consortium had tried to provide. Emergency trading halts couldn't stop the hemorrhaging, and by noon, the company had lost 70% of its market value. But the financial damage was only the beginning. Within hours, the Department of Justice announced criminal investigations into price-fixing conspiracies. The Food and Drug Administration revoked several Sterling patents that had been obtained through fraudulent applications. State attorneys general filed racketeering charges that could result in the seizure of all Sterling family assets. "Phase 2 can launch this afternoon," Dr. Warren announced. "The Hartford nursing home scandal?" Margaret nodded, but her attention was focused on her phone, which had been ringing constantly since the stories broke. Journalists wanted interviews,
Politicians wanted statements, and victim families wanted to share their stories. Most importantly, other whistleblowers were beginning to come forward. Sterling employees with additional evidence, regulatory officials who'd been pressured to suppress investigations, healthcare workers with documentation of preventable deaths. The floodgates are opening, Sarah observed. People are ready to talk. Alexander joined Margaret at the window, where they watched protesters beginning to gather in the plaza below. Signs demanding justice for diabetic victims were already visible, and more people were arriving every minute. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked. "Once we destroy the nursing home operations and move on to defense contracting, we'll be at war with the entire power structure. They'll throw everything they have at us." Margaret thought about her father, murdered for trying to expose the very corruption they were now dismantling. She thought about Jennifer Morrison, killed by drunk driving that was covered up to protect wealthy families. She thought about Sarah's daughter Emma, who died because medicine was treated as a luxury good rather than a human right. "Let them come," she said. "We have $1 billion, the truth on our side, and nothing left to lose." Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You've made a terrible mistake. The consortium does not forgive and it does not forget. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Margaret showed the message to Alexander, who read it with grim satisfaction. "They're scared. Good." Margaret deleted the message and turned back to the displays, showing real-time coverage of the Sterling scandal. For the first time in 27 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, not hiding from power, but wielding it in service of something larger than herself. "Dr. Warren," she called out, "how long until the Hartford story is ready?" 2 hours, maybe 3. Make it 1. I want to hit them while they're still reeling from Sterling. And Sarah, start reaching out to military families affected by unnecessary deployments. It's time to expose the defense contracting corruption. Margaret Rothschild was fully awake now, and she intended to use every resource at her disposal to tear down the system that had destroyed so many lives. The consortium had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that money was the only thing that mattered to her. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the marble-floored lobby of what had once been Sterling Pharmaceuticals headquarters, now transformed into the Morrison Institute for Medical Ethics. The building buzzed with purposeful activity as researchers, advocates, and healthcare workers collaborated on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Open-source drug development, transparent pricing models, and patient advocacy programs funded by the forfeited assets of convicted executives. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. The Sterling family's pharmaceutical empire, valued at $47 billion before Margaret's campaign began, had been systematically dismantled through criminal prosecutions, regulatory actions, and shareholder lawsuits. The family patriarch, Lawrence Sterling III, was serving a 25-year sentence for racketeering and conspiracy to commit fraud. His sons faced similar charges, and the family's vast wealth had been seized and redirected to victim compensation funds and public health initiatives. Most importantly, insulin was now free for every diabetic in America, distributed through a non-profit foundation established with seized Sterling assets. The price manipulation that had killed thousands of people was not just stopped, it had been made impossible through new regulatory frameworks that treated essential medicines as public utilities rather than private profit centers. Margaret, Sarah Martinez, appeared at her side, tablet in hand and a satisfied smile on her face. Sarah had become the Institute's director of patient advocacy, channeling her grief over her daughter Emma's death into a systematic campaign to ensure that no other child would die from rationed medicine. The final numbers are in from the Hartford prosecutions. Margaret accepted the tablet, scanning the summary of what had become the largest corporate criminal case in American history. The Hartford family's nursing home empire had collapsed even faster than Sterling's pharmaceutical operations, brought down by leaked documents that revealed deliberate understaffing, systematic neglect, and financial fraud that had resulted in the preventable deaths of over 8,000 elderly residents. 43 executives convicted, Margaret read aloud. 67 facilities shut down and transferred to nonprofit management. $2 billion in victim compensation, and most importantly, new federal standards that require minimum staffing levels and surprise inspections, Sarah finished. Maria's grandmother would be proud. Margaret smiled, remembering Maria Santos from their days at the Sterling Club. The young woman was now studying pre-med at Stanford on a scholarship funded by recovered Hartford assets, determined to become a geriatrician who would ensure elderly patients received the dignity and care they deserved. Her grandmother had lived long enough to see the nursing home investigations begin and had died peacefully in a reformed facility with adequate nursing care and her family at her side. The Hartford prosecutions had been followed by an avalanche of accountability that swept through every level of the elder care industry. Private equity firms that had bought nursing homes solely to extract profits were forced to divest or face criminal charges. Regulatory agencies that had ignored abuse complaints were reorganized with new leadership. Politicians who had taken campaign contributions in exchange for lax oversight found themselves facing ethics investigations and electoral challenges. "What's the latest from the defense contracting cases?" Margaret asked. Her expression grew more serious. "The Caldwell trials start next month. 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and war profiteering. If the Justice Department gets convictions on even half the charges, the family will spend the rest of their lives in prison." The Caldwell case had been the most complex of all their targets, involving decades of fraudulent contracts, unnecessary military interventions, and the systematic corruption of defense procurement processes. But it was also the most personally significant for Margaret, as it directly addressed the culture of violence and impunity that had led to Jennifer Morrison's death 30 years earlier.
Thomas Caldwell, the drunk driver who had killed Jennifer and escaped justice through his family's connections, was now facing not just vehicular homicide charges. The statute of limitations had been extended after new evidence emerged, but also conspiracy charges related to his role in his family's defense contracting fraud. The same networks that had covered up his crime had been used to secure billions in fraudulent government contracts. "Any word from the international investigations?" Margaret asked. "Viktor Petrov was arrested in Monaco yesterday," Sarah replied with satisfaction. "The Swiss authorities are cooperating fully with the money laundering prosecutions. It looks like we'll recover most of the remaining stolen assets within the next 6 months." Margaret nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The network of corruption that had killed her father and stolen his legacy was being systematically dismantled, person by person, transaction by transaction, lie by lie. The investigation had spread far beyond the original consortium families, exposing a web of international money laundering, political corruption, and corporate fraud that spanned multiple continents. "Margaret?" Alexander's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching with a group of visitors, journalists, activists, and policymakers from around the world who had come to study what was being called the American Spring, the peaceful but revolutionary transformation of corporate power structures that had begun with a simple observation about handwriting. "How are our international guests finding the Institute?" Margaret asked. "Impressed? The European Union is considering similar reforms to pharmaceutical pricing. The Canadian government wants to implement our nursing home standards, and there's a coalition of African nations interested in our open-source drug development program." Margaret felt a familiar surge of hope. The changes they'd initiated in America were beginning to ripple outward, inspiring similar movements around the world. The Morrison Institute had become not just a monument to the victims of corporate greed,
but a laboratory for developing economic systems that prioritized human welfare over concentrated wealth. "There's someone here I think you should meet," Alexander continued, gesturing to a young woman in the group of visitors. "Dr. Lisa Chen, no relation, from the World Health Organization. She's been documenting the global impact of our pharmaceutical reforms." Dr. Chen stepped forward with a warm smile and an energy that reminded Margaret of her younger self. "Miss Rothschild, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. The insulin distribution program you established has already been replicated in 12 countries. We estimate that your actions have saved over 50,000 lives in the past 6 months alone." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. 50,000 people. Children like Emma Martinez, elderly diabetics who'd been rationing medicine, working families choosing between food and health care, all alive because she'd chosen to fight instead of hide. "That's not my achievement," Margaret replied quietly. "It's what happens when people choose justice over profit." As the delegation moved through the Institute's halls, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The scared waitress who'd trembled at Alexander's recognition was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true power lay not in hiding from responsibility, but in embracing it fully. Later that evening, Margaret found herself back at the Sterling Club, now under new management and transformed into a worker cooperative where former servers owned shares and made collective decisions. James Park had become head chef and part owner, his weathered face bright with the satisfaction of running a kitchen that served excellent food while treating its employees with dignity. "You know what I realized?" James said as they shared a quiet dinner after the restaurant had closed. "You were never really hiding. You were learning. 27 years of understanding what it means to work for wages, to depend on tips, to worry about health insurance. That's what made you the right person to tear down the old system." Margaret smiled, thinking of the young woman she'd once been, brilliant but naive, convinced that good intentions were enough to change the world. The Margaret who'd fled her inheritance was running from power itself. The Margaret who'd returned to claim it understood that power without empathy was corruption, but empathy without power was merely sentiment. Alexander joined them, carrying news that the last of the consortium families had agreed to a plea bargain that would fund education and healthcare programs for decades to come. The war was over, won not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient application of truth and consequences. "What's next?" he asked. Margaret looked around the dining room where her new life had begun with a simple mistake in handwriting. The tables that had once hosted corrupt deals now welcomed teachers, social workers, and community organizers planning better futures for their neighborhoods. The Sterling Club had become what it always should have been, a place where people gathered to serve something larger than themselves.
"Now we make sure this never happens again," she said. "We built institutions that can't be bought, systems that serve people instead of profit, and a world where someone's handwriting never has to give away their past because they have nothing to hide from their future." 27 years of hiding had taught her the value of anonymity. 6 months of fighting had shown her the power of standing in the light. Margaret Rothschild had finally found her true legacy, not in the fortune she'd inherited, but in the justice she'd chosen to create. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.